Hello and welcome to my channel. We have a slightly murky landscape today, but don't worry, spring is just around the corner. But for now we have this. This was all done in charcoal, mostly charcoal pencils and vine charcoal, but I also used a little bit of graphite here and there, as you will see. So let's have a look. As usual, we start with the sketch and the composition. I have to decide where the water line will be and where I will place all of these trees and rocks and things like that. So I did a little bit of sketching with a graphite pencil, but it's just to give myself a rough idea where everything is going to be, and then I can just take it from there. Now for the water, I decided to use a little bit of vine charcoal because I'm going to be working on that, erasing a little bit, adding more value, and vine charcoal is easy to manipulate, so it's good to have something that's easily moved and modified. So vine charcoal can be useful for drawing the surface of the water. Now I used a big brush to spread a little bit of charcoal on the background because I want a little bit of value there as well. And now you can see that I'm using a tortillon and a little bit of graphite pencil to draw these trees in the back. So why am I doing that? Why did I use a tortillon? Because I want to avoid too much value and I want to avoid too much texture. Because whenever you're drawing, whether they are trees or other objects in the distance, they will tend to be lighter and sometimes even blurrier. And the objects in the foreground, which are closer to the viewer, will have more contrast, cleaner edges, more texture. This is usually because of the atmospheric effect, but when you have a misty scene or a slightly foggy scene like this one, that effect is additionally amplified. So as you can see, to give myself some depth, first I drew these lighter trees in the back, and then in front of them I drew some trees with a little bit more value. So these are darker, they have a little bit more contrast, and their shapes and edges are cleaner and more defined. That is how you create an illusion of depth in a forest. Now here on this bank, there will also be a nice tree that's kind of leaning towards the right side, which I really liked in my reference photo, so I decided to keep it. But anyway, I started working on this bank on the right and putting in some texture to try to imitate wet ground, but eventually, as you'll see, I decided to cover it with a little bit more charcoal to create some more darker value. And I also removed a lot of that texture because I wasn't really happy with the way it looked. I wanted something a little bit more blurry and less defined there, because I'm going to have some more stuff in the foreground. So I can't really have too much texture there. I just did a little bit of variation in terms of value just to create some illusion of detail. But what I'm mostly interested in is adding in these smaller trees and branches just to create an impression like there's a thick forest there. There's a nice rock here in the foreground with its reflection, and now as you can see I'm working on the reflection reflections of these trees on the right. And the way I'm doing that is by creating a wavy interrupted line so that it kind of looks like a reflection in the water, because the ripples are kind of breaking the straight line of the reflected image. And I also use my tortillon to pull them to the side, from one side to the other a little bit, to create an additional illusion of ripples in the water. But as you can see, I have to try to roughly match what's above the surface of the water. I have to try to match the trees. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as I can place some of my reflections so that they roughly match what's above the water, it will be convincing enough. Now here I'm moving on to these rocks on the right, and how I'm going to do that is I'm first going to put in these darker areas in between the rocks, and then when I go over it with a brush and a tortillon, hopefully some of that contrast will still remain there. And if I feel like I lost some of the contrast, if I feel like some of these areas, some of these rocks need to be a bit lighter because they're facing the light source, I'll just go back in with a pencil eraser or kneaded eraser and clean them up a little bit, remove a little bit of the value and make them a little bit lighter. So here again I'm working a little bit more on the surface of the water, and I want some variation in value there as well, because I want some part of it to be lighter and some parts to be darker, so that they match what's above the water, so that it looks like these are reflections. And the trees all the way back, which are in the middle of my paper, I want these to be the lightest and barely visible. So this is again a sort of a slightly foggy landscape with some bare branches, bare overhanging branches. Maybe it looks a little bit gloomy, but I thought it was a good scene to draw. So I'm going to have a couple of trees here in the foreground on the right. There is one larger one all the way on the right, and a couple of twisted, thinner ones, smaller ones. And these are going to have really long branches which are kind of going to be hanging over that water and moving all the way to the left. So I almost want the branches from the left side and the right side to form a sort of an arch, and I'm going to have a slightly lighter area in the middle. That's the general idea for this landscape. But the key to making this landscape look good, I think, is of course that creation of depth, which has to be achieved by controlling the amount of value of these trees depending on where they are placed, whether they are in the midground or the background or the foreground. And as long as the stuff in the foreground is a lot darker with a lot more contrast and detail, and the stuff in the back is very light and barely visible, I will be able to create that depth to make it look like an actual forest. And this is what I've done with many other of my landscapes. And when you're drawing other stuff, like for example hills or mountains, you are basically trying to achieve a similar effect because the hills and the mountains in front are always going to be a little bit darker and a little bit more defined, and those in the back will be lighter because of the atmospheric effect. But like I said, when you have fog or mist, all of that gets even more pronounced, even more amplified. So the branches can be a little bit tricky to draw. I can't really explain how that's done. I mean, you just have to practice a little bit. I'm not saying mine are perfect. It's just that you have to observe, you have to see them in real life and try to get an idea about what their shape is. Generally speaking, I mean, they taper as they grow further, and they kind of fan out because there are smaller ones growing from the larger boughs. There are smaller branches growing from them, so they taper and they kind of fan out with lots of smaller branches and twigs. And this is obviously even more obvious when you have bare trees. When you have leaves and when you have full canopies full of foliage, then it's a whole different story because you have to draw trees differently, obviously. But when you have bare branches, you really have to focus on their shape, and you have to try to make them twisted and to make them look as organic as possible. Here you can see that I'm inserting a few highlights in the water here and there, a few of these lighter areas. And in addition to the tortillas which I used for drawing these lighter trees, I also used a graphite pencil, because the graphite pencil produces very light marks, but it also allows me to create some of these branches, because obviously a graphite pencil makes it easier to draw them, much easier than a tortillon, which would leave a thicker mark. So I used a combination of a tortillon and a graphite pencil to draw some of these lighter trees in the background. And for the trees in the foreground, I mostly used charcoal because I want them to be darker. So you can see how nicely these branches are coming along, even though this takes a little bit of patience. In case you're wondering how much time all of this takes in real time, it's probably under 2 hours. But anyway, I'm just putting down some finishing touches and maybe refining the shape of some of these branches and twigs. And now I'm just going to finish the drawing, and I'm going to sign it here in the lower left corner. And now I have to remove this tape and spray the drawing with a fixative. So here it is. I've removed the tape. I chose to create a slightly wider margin this time, but this is what it looks like. I hope you like this landscape as well. Here I zoomed in just a tiny bit so that you can see it a little bit better. Don't forget to check out my other landscapes, and also don't forget to subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching. Bye.